The silence of Briarwood Cottage was a living thing. It seeped from the damp stone walls and clung to the threadbare curtains, a constant companion to Eleanor's grief. It had been 2 years since Robert's death, 2 years since the world had shrunk to the size of this forgotten dower house on the edge of the vast Blackwood estate. Her hope had worn thin, like a cherished shawl left too long in the sun, its colours faded to a ghost of what they once were. She stood at the mullioned window, looking out at the garden. It was a wilderness of neglect, a mirror of her own heart. Weeds choked the rose bushes Robert had planted, and the stone path was a treacherous mosaic of moss and cracked flags. This place was both her sanctuary and her prison, a provision from a man she had never met, the formidable Duke of Blackwood, her late husband's father, a man who had never acknowledged her existence, nor that of his only grandson. A letter had confirmed his disdain. Not a letter to her, of course. It was a correspondence between the Duke and his solicitor, one that Robert had shown her in a fit of desperate, hopeful defiance just weeks before his riding accident. The words were burned into her memory, an unsuitable match, a woman of no consequence or connection, ensure the entail is ironclad. He had seen her as a predator, a schemer who had trapped his heir. He had never seen the love she and Robert shared, a quiet, fierce thing that had been their only shield against the world's disapproval. Now, that shield was gone. All she had left was Thomas, her 5-year-old son, a miniature of his father with the same serious eyes and a laugh that was the only music left in the house. For him, she endured the isolation, the condescending pity from the village, and the crushing weight of the Duke's silent judgment. The allowance he provided was just enough to keep them from starvation, but not enough to erase the constant, gnawing anxiety. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a debt collector. Every gust of wind felt like a threat of eviction. Her life was a fixed point of quiet desperation. She was Lady Ashworth in name only, a widow sustained by the cold charity of a father-in-law who despised her. She was 27 years old, and her future was a blank, fog-shrouded landscape. There was nothing to be done but endure. The arrival of the letter from the estate factor was therefore an unwelcome disruption. It was brief and impersonal, informing her that a groundskeeper had been assigned to Briarwood to reclaim the gardens. It was not a request, it was a decree. She felt a surge of helpless anger. Her wild, grieving garden was her own. To have it tamed by a stranger, by his stranger, felt like a violation. But she had no recourse. The Duke owned the house, the garden, the very air she breathed. A few days later, he arrived. Eleanor watched from the same window as a man walked up the overgrown path. He was older than she expected, perhaps past 50, with a stocky, powerful build. He carried no grand collection of tools, just a simple canvas satchel. His hair was thick and iron grey, but it was his eyes that caught her, even from a distance. They were a deep, startling blue, and they scanned the dilapidated cottage not with a servant's deference, but with an unnerving proprietary assessment. He did not knock at the main door. He went around to the back, to the small potting shed, as if he knew the way. She felt a chill crawl over her skin. This was the Duke's man. An observer, a spy. Her small, sad world was about to be invaded. His name, she learned from a brief, formal introduction at the back door, was Arthur. His voice was a low rumble, his words clipped and precise. He did not tug his forelock or offer the usual servile pleasantries. He simply inclined his head and said, "I am here for the garden, my lady." There was a stillness about him that was unnerving. His silence was not empty, but dense and heavy like the air before a storm. The first week, he worked with a silent, relentless efficiency. He did not attack the garden with brute force. He moved through it with a strange reverence, studying the lay of the land, the health of the trees, the way the light fell. He started with the choking ivy, patiently untangling it from the stone walls. His hands, she noticed, were large and calloused, but they moved with a surprising delicacy. They were not the clumsy hands of a common labourer. Eleanor watched him from her window, a prisoner observing her warden. He never looked up at the house, yet she felt his awareness of her as a constant pressure. He was a puzzle she could not solve. He worked from dawn until dusk, taking his midday meal of bread and cheese on a stone bench, his back to the cottage. He spoke to no one. Thomas, however, was unafraid. One afternoon, he slipped out of the house and approached the quiet man who was carefully resetting a loose flagstone. Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat. She rushed to the door, ready to call him back, but stopped, her hand on the latch. Arthur had not startled. He had simply paused, his hammer resting on the stone. He looked at the small boy, and for the first time, Eleanor saw the rigid set of his shoulders soften. Thomas pointed a small finger at a robin perched on a branch. "Bird," he said, his voice clear in the still air. Arthur followed his gaze. A slow, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "A robin redbreast," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "He is looking for what—" He then turned his attention back to the stone. But he began to speak quietly to the boy, explaining how the stones fit together, how the earth needed to be firm beneath them. Thomas sat on the grass, utterly captivated, watching the strong hands at work. From that day on, an unlikely friendship formed. Thomas would spend hours in the garden, a small shadow to the large, quiet man. Arthur showed him how to tell an oak from an ash, pointed out a sparrow's nest hidden in the eaves, and answered his endless stream of questions with a gruff, surprising patience. Eleanor watched this unfolding scene with a mixture of relief and deepening suspicion. This was not the behavior of a simple groundskeeper. This was something else entirely. One day, she saw him examining the old bird bath in the center of the garden. It was a casualty of years of frost and neglect, its basin cracked, and the small carved wren that had once perched on its rim long since broken off and lost. He ran his hand over the weathered stone, his touch contemplative. The next morning he arrived not with a spade and shears, but with a different set of tools from his satchel, chisels and mallets. He did not try to mend the bird bath. He began to work on a new block of limestone he must have procured from the estate quarry. All day, the quiet tap-tap-tap of his mallet echoed through the garden. He was not repairing, he was creating. Eleanor found herself drawn to the window again and again, mesmerized, slowly. Impossibly, a shape began to emerge from the stone. It was a bird, its head cocked, its wings half furled. It was exquisitely detailed, alive with a grace that spoke of immense practiced skill. Who was this man? A failed artist? A stonemason fallen on hard times? No groundskeeper possessed such talent. Her unease grew, a constant, low hum beneath the surface of her daze. He was more than he seemed, and his presence felt less like a service and more like a vigil. A letter from the Duke's solicitor arrived, colder and more pointed than the last. It inquired after her long-term intentions and mentioned, with chilling vagueness, the various claims upon the estate. The implication was clear. Her tenancy at Briarwood was not guaranteed. Her security was a thread that could be snipped at any moment. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She clutched the letter, the paper crinkling in her fist. She had nowhere else to go. She and Thomas would be destitute. That night, a storm broke, lashing the cottage with wind and rain. Thomas awoke with a fever, his small body hot to the touch, his breathing ragged. The village doctor was 5 miles away, a treacherous journey on a night like this. Eleanor sat by his bed, bathing his forehead with a cool cloth, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. A soft knock came at the back door. It was Arthur, his coat slick with rain, his face etched with concern. He must have seen the light in Thomas's window. "The boy," he said, his voice low. It was not a question. "A fever," she whispered, her own voice trembling. "I need the doctor." He did not hesitate. "I will go." Before she could protest, to argue that he could not take one of the estate horses, that he would be dismissed, he was gone, melting into the churning darkness. He moved with a sense of purpose, of authority, that brooked no argument. He did not send for a stable boy, he went himself, as if the Duke's stables were his own to command. He returned hours later, just before dawn, with the weary doctor in tow. Arthur was soaked through, his face pale with exhaustion, but his gaze went straight to the upstairs window. The doctor administered a tincture and assured her the fever would break by morning. As he left, Eleanor found Arthur in the kitchen, dripping onto the flagstones, staring into the cold hearth. She did not know what to do. He was her servant, yet he had just saved her son. The lines of rank and station felt absurd in the face of his stark exhaustion and her profound gratitude. On impulse, she stoked the embers in the hearth and heated a mug of milk with honey. She handed it to him, her fingers brushing his. His hand was as cold as ice. He took the mug, his gaze meeting hers over the rim. For a moment, the carefully constructed walls between them crumbled. She saw not a groundskeeper, but a man, tired, worried, and impossibly kind. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling wholly inadequate. He merely nodded, his blue eyes holding a universe of unspoken things. He drank the milk in silence, and then, with a slight bow of his head, retreated back to his own small quarters. Eleanor stood in the quiet kitchen, her heart aching with a confusion so deep it felt like another kind of grief. She had been so certain he was a spy sent to judge her, but a spy would not ride through a storm for a child he barely knew. The fever broke, as the doctor had promised. Thomas was weak but recovering. The garden, washed clean by the storm, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Arthur was back at his work, the steady, rhythmic tapping of his mallet on stone a comforting sound. The bird was nearly complete. It was a masterpiece, a perfect rendering of a wren in mid-song. Her suspicion had now curdled into a certainty that demanded answers. His speech was too educated. His knowledge of the estate's paths and shortcuts was too intimate. And his hands were those of an artist, not a digger of soil. But it was the way he looked at Thomas that haunted her most. It was not just kindness. It was a fierce, protective tenderness. It was a look of ownership, of profound connection that he tried and failed to conceal. One afternoon, while Arthur was working at the far end of the garden, Eleanor found herself drawn to the potting shed he used as his workshop. It felt like a terrible transgression, a violation of the trust he had shown her, but she could not stop herself. The need to know was a physical ache. The shed smelled of damp earth, oil, and stone dust. His tools were laid out with meticulous care on a rough wooden bench. Beside the chisels lay a worn leather pouch. Her breath caught. It was not something a groundskeeper would carry. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, the leather soft and supple beneath her touch. She untied the drawstring and tipped the contents into her palm. A heavy gold signet ring fell out, landing with a soft thud in her hand. It was warm from being kept close to a body. Engraved on its face was a crest she knew as well as her own name, a crest she had seen on Robert's letters on the gates of the estate, the snarling wolf's head of the House of Blackwood. The truth landed in her mind with the shocking stillness of a bird hitting a window pane. Arthur was not a spy. He was the spy master. He was Alistair, Duke of Blackwood, her husband's father, her son's grandfather, the man who held her entire world in his hands. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She leaned against the workbench, the ring digging into her palm. Every interaction, every kindness, every quiet observation was cast in a new, terrifying light. He had not come to tend her garden. He had come to inspect her. He had embedded himself in her life to pass judgment, to decide if she was worthy of the scraps he threw her. Rage, hot and cleansing, burned away the fog of confusion. It was followed by a pain so sharp it stole her breath. He had watched her struggle, watched her grieve, watched her fear for her child's life, all from behind a cruel disguise. He had played with her son, using a false identity to gain access to their most vulnerable moments. She stumbled out of the shed, the ring still clutched in her hand, and saw him in the garden. He was standing by the bird bath, putting the finishing touches on the stone wren. The setting sun cast long shadows, and in the golden light, he looked less like a duke and more like what he had pretended to be, a simple man finding solace in his work. His face, unguarded, was a mask of sorrow. He was not just a duke, he was a father who had lost his only son, a grief she knew intimately. He looked up then, as if sensing her presence. His gaze fell to her clenched fist, and he knew. The charade was over. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking old and terribly weary. The tools fell from his hands, clattering on the stone path. He stood before her, stripped of his title and his disguise, a man utterly exposed. He was Alistair, and he was at her mercy. Eleanor walked toward him, her steps steady on the path he himself had repaired. The rage had cooled to a hard, clear resolve. She held all the power now. She could scream, she could rage, she could expose him to the world as a fraud who had preyed on his own son's widow. She could demand a settlement, security, a title for Thomas. She could ruin him with a single, well-placed word to a society that would delight in such a scandal. She stopped in front of him, so close she could see the flicker of fear in his proud blue eyes. She held his gaze for a long moment, letting the silence stretch, letting him feel the full weight of his deception. He did not speak. He waited for his sentence. Slowly, she uncurled her fingers and looked down at the heavy gold ring in her palm. Then she looked at the finished stone bird, so perfect, so full of life. It was a wren, Robert's favorite. He loved to watch the wrens, she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the evening air. Robert, he would sit on that bench for hours, just watching them. He would have liked this. Alistair flinched as if she had struck him. A strangled sound escaped his throat. He had expected an empress's wrath, but she had given him a wife's memory. She had met his deception not with accusation, but with a shared grief, a bridge built between them over the chasm of his lies. She held out the ring. "This belongs to you, Your Grace." He did not take it. He could not seem to move. "Eleanor," he began, his voice rough with an emotion she could not name. She did not let him continue. She was not finished. "I understand why you came," she said, her voice gaining strength. "You came to see the creature who ruined your son. You came to find a reason to cast us out. I hope you found what you were looking for." "I did," he whispered, his gaze falling. "But it was not what I expected." "No," she agreed. "I imagine it was not." She drew a breath, steeling herself. This was the moment. This was her choice. Thomas deserves to know his grandfather. He has lost too much already. But he will not meet the Duke of Blackwood. Not yet. He looked up, his expression a mixture of confusion and dawning hope. "He will know Arthur," she continued, laying down her terms. "He will know the man who taught him about birds, who fixed the path, and who rode through a storm for him. The man who was kind. The Duke can be introduced later, when my son is old enough to understand, but his first memory of his grandfather will be of a good man. Those are my conditions." She was not begging for a place in his world. She was defining the terms of his entry into hers. She was protecting her son, not with hysterics or demands for money, but with a quiet, unshakable dignity. Alistair stared at her, his formidable ducal mask completely gone. He looked at this woman of no consequence, and he saw a strength that humbled him. She had faced him down not with power, but with grace. He had come to judge her worthiness, and she had shown him the poverty of his own. "I came," he said, his voice thick with shame, "because I was a bitter, grieving fool. I blamed you for my son's defiance. I blamed you for his death. I was wrong. I came here to find a flaw, an excuse. Instead, I found a woman of extraordinary courage raising my grandson alone, with more grace than my entire house possesses. I stayed because I could not bear to leave. Because watching you and Thomas, it was the first time I felt anything but anger in 2 years." He finally reached out and took the ring from her palm, his fingers brushing hers. "Your conditions are more than generous," he said softly. "They are a gift, one I do not deserve." He looked toward the cottage, where a lamp had just been lit in the window. "I would be honored," he said, "to be Arthur for as long as you will have me." And so the Duke remained a groundskeeper. A year passed. The garden at Briarwood Cottage was no longer a wilderness of sorrow, but a riot of colour and life. The roses bloomed in profusion, their scent sweet on the summer air. The stone path was clear and even, and at its centre the bird bath held clean water for the wrens, the exquisitely carved stone bird standing sentinel on its rim. Life had found a new rhythm. Alistair, for he was Alistair to her now, in the quiet moments after Thomas was asleep, still worked in the garden. It was his penance and his peace. To Thomas, he was simply Arthur, his beloved companion, the source of endless stories and patient lessons. To the outside world, the Duke of Blackwood was travelling abroad, his affairs managed by his solicitor. The cold, formal allowance had been replaced by a quiet, unspoken security. The larder was always full. A new pony appeared in the paddock for Thomas, and a warm winter cloak for Eleanor was delivered from a London tailor. They were gifts that appeared without announcement, acts of care disguised as estate business. Eleanor watched him one late afternoon from the drawing room. He was on the lawn with Thomas, showing him how to fly a kite. His laughter, a rare and wonderful sound, carried on the breeze. He was no longer the stiff, silent man who had first arrived. The grief was still there, etched in the lines around his eyes, but it was softer now, balanced by a newfound lightness. He had learned to live in the present. He had never once overstepped his bounds. He had honored her terms with a fierce integrity she had not expected. He had earned his place not with his title or his wealth, but with his patience, his kindness, and his unwavering devotion to her and her son. He saw her at the window and smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that made her heart ache. He said something to Thomas, who then ran toward the house, his face bright with excitement. Alistair followed at a slower pace, his gaze never leaving hers. He stopped before her on the terrace. "Eleanor," he said, his voice serious. He held out his hand. In his palm lay the signet ring. "It is time for Arthur to leave." Her heart stopped. "What do you mean? Thomas is a strong, happy boy," he said. "He knows he is loved. He is ready to meet his grandfather, the Duke." He paused, his blue eyes searching her face. "But the Duke is a lonely man. He has discovered that his grand house is cold and empty, and that all the warmth in the world resides in a small cottage with a wild garden." He took her hand, his calloused fingers closing gently around hers. "I did not know what love was. With Robert, it was pride and duty. But this past year, watching you, learning from you, I have learned what it is to care for someone so much that their happiness becomes the foundation of your own. I am not asking you to be my Duchess. I am asking, Eleanor, if you would consider being my wife, not for a title or for this estate, but to be my partner, my friend, my family." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his image. He had come to her home to decide if she was worthy. He had stayed because he had discovered he was not, and in the ruins of his own pride, he had found something far more valuable. He had found them. She did not need a grand house or a title. She had everything she had ever wanted right here. A home filled with love, a future for her son, and a man who saw her, truly saw her, for who she was. Yes, she whispered, the word a release, a promise, a beginning. Yes, Alistair, I will. True worth, she had learned, was not a thing granted by society or measured in titles. It was cultivated quietly, like a hidden garden, nurtured by resilience and watered by love, blooming in its own time, against all odds.